When the protagonist first returned to his family's ancestral cabin, he expected quiet nostalgia, and perhaps the comfort of continuity after years away caring for his late mother. Instead, his homecoming began with a jarring conflict. Neighbors received false legal warnings from a fabricated outlet called Valley Collective News. Articles condemned the protagonist as a destabilizing extremist, while official-looking mailings terrified residents with warnings of crushing liabilities. But careful investigation exposed the smear network as a fraudulent content mill used in multiple states. By leaning on his inspector's background and Riley's legal scrutiny, the protagonist dismantled yet another layer of her scheme. Outrage spread as neighbors realized they had been manipulated by scare tactics, kickbacks, and sham media designed to monetize fear. Karen's credibility began to crumble rapidly, though her desperation only deepened. The most decisive turning point came through science. Understanding how confusion thrived in ambiguity, the protagonist organized a watershed demonstration that used biodegradable dyes to trace the valley's natural runoff paths. Before officials, lawyers, and residents, the colored streams aligned perfectly with the federally documented boundaries marking Carter family land. What once had been mere paperwork became vivid, visible truth under the autumn sun. Karen's attempt to intervene backfired, as her ignorance of basic hydrology exposed her as unqualified and manipulative. The valley, it turned out, spoke for itself. Residents saw with their own eyes that nature upheld the historic deeds. Her authority, long rooted in polished presentation and fear, collapsed in front of everyone. Federal investigators soon uncovered the wider web of her fraud. Her fake oversight bodies, intimidation tactics, and fabricated authority had reached across multiple states, pulling in hundreds of thousands of illicit dollars. What began as a neighborhood dispute was now a criminal case of national scope. Karen faced fraud, mail deception, impersonation of officials, and conspiracy charges. Even her longtime ally, Noah Grant, turned witness when federal prosecutors expanded their net. In the end, the resolution was not just about reclaiming a cabin, but safeguarding the valley itself. Formal protections were instituted. The federal survey markers and watershed runoff became environmental conservation zones, safeguarding both property rights and ecological systems. Neighbors found a renewed sense of trust by establishing transparent HOA governance that stressed legal oversight and financial accountability. The Carter family's land was not only restored but recognized as a vital part of both cultural, history, and environmental stewardship. What began as one man, defending his porch, closed with an entire community. Learning the value of vigilance, truth, and lawful authority, Karen's empire collapsed because it was built on intimidation rather than integrity. Yet her unraveling also rebuilt something more vital. A neighborhood that would never again surrender blindly to polished deception. In the end, the land itself became the strongest witness, reminding everyone that boundaries are not redefined by power plays but by truth carved into stone, water, and memory. At its heart, this saga is less about a boundary dispute and more about power. Who claims it, who abuses it, and who truly deserves it. Karen Pierce, the HOA president, exemplifies the danger of authority untethered from accountability. At the beginning, her voice rings with corporate polish, polished enough to convince some neighbors that she is serving their interests. She dresses power in the language of enhancement, shared benefit, and community improvement, phrases designed to soften control and make it appear benevolent. Yet beneath the rhetoric lies a brazen attempt to seize land not her own. True authority, as the protagonist soon demonstrates, flows not from intimidation but from legitimacy, deeds, surveys, and historical continuity. This theme of power is therefore central, its misuse by Karen and its proper exercise by those who respect law and truth. Contrasting sharply with her manipulative jargon is the theme of law versus deception. The story repeatedly illustrates how easily legalese can be faked, appropriated, or weaponized. Karen begins with claims of abandonment protocols, suggesting she can declare property inactive and seize it through HOA authority. Such words sound professional to an untrained ear, but in truth they are legal fantasies. By contrast, the protagonist and his ally Riley present genuine documents, deeds, and survey records. In fact, a single federal boundary stone, weathered but enduring, outweighs binder after binder of empty charts. This juxtaposition highlights that the law, when truly understood, has clarity, while deception thrives in complexity. Karen built her case out of imitation, fake memos, counterfeit inspection reports, fabricated notices. But every fake authority eventually collapsed against the bedrock of actual governance. The theme is timeless. Legal systems protect when respected, but they can be twisted into weapons by those who exploit others' ignorance. Yet law alone does not resolve the crisis. The story explores how community dynamics shape outcomes when people are divided between trust and fear. Karen's greatest weapon is neither her paperwork nor her fraud. It is her ability to manipulate neighbors emotionally. She frames opposition as selfishness, questions the protagonist's absence during his mother's illness, and casts herself as protector of children and shared values. This emotional manipulation works, at least for a time. Neighbors turn cold, rumors spread, and fear corrodes solidarity. However, as the truth appears, through testimony, through science, and through courage, communities begin to realign. Witnesses such as Tom Bradley break silence. Elders like Louise Harper remind everyone of history. And the colored streams of the watershed demonstration literally show the land's truth. By the end, community unity has been rebuilt not on fear but on shared recognition of what actually protects them. The story suggests that law provides the framework, but people must still choose courage over comfort to apply it. The theme of fraud and its consequences adds a darker layer. Karen's schemes escalate step by step, from using inflated HOA authority to manufacturing false media outlets, from intimidating contractors to staging inspections with imposter officials. Each tactic reveals how deception grows bolder when unchecked. Fraud here is not abstract. It shatters trust, terrifies homeowners, and leads some to consider selling their houses in panic. Yet the consequences are equally dramatic. Federal investigations, criminal indictments, restitution orders, revoked licenses. The narrative thus demonstrates that fraud may appear powerful in the short term, but leaves traces, paper trails, digital data, frightened victims, that ultimately lead to collapse. The story captures not only the damage fraud creates, but also the heavy price fraudsters pay when truth catches up. Towering above all these themes is perhaps the most profound: stewardship versus exploitation. The protagonist does not view his land merely as real estate but as heritage, a responsibility passed down through generations. The watershed demonstration makes this point vividly. The colored streams reveal that his family's parcel aligns with natural flow systems that prevent flooding and support emergency evacuation. His claim to the land is not only legal but ecological. Ownership becomes inseparable from stewardship. Karen, however, represents the opposite: exploitation for personal ambition. She ignores the land's natural systems, risks fire safety, and endangers environmental integrity, all to push her subdivision visions. By contrasting stewardship and exploitation, the narrative reframes the conflict. The true owner is not just the one with a deed, but the one who respects the land and its role in the broader ecosystem. Collectively, these themes stitch together a story that is about far more than a cabin porch or an HOA dispute. It is a morality tale about the fragility of truth when confronted by manipulation, about the necessity of vigilance when authority is abused, and about the strength of communities when they refuse to cower before intimidation. Power dressed in polished speeches collapses when measured against facts. Legal clarity, though sometimes buried under layers of deception, shines decisively once uncovered. Communities, though vulnerable to manipulation, can rally around truth when provided evidence they can see and touch. Fraud, though frightfully effective in the short term, contains the seeds of its own exposure, and stewardship, quiet and steady, proves more enduring than ambition disguised as progress. By the close, the valley is not just the protagonist's inheritance. It is a living testament to these lessons. The Carter Basin is preserved as protected watershed. Neighbors gain self-awareness and resilience, and even the law itself gains new precedent against HOA fraud nationwide. The final lesson, echoed in the carved granite marker and the wooden conservation sign, is unequivocal. Real power is not domination through fear, but protection through truth. At the center of the story is the protagonist, Mr. Carter, whose return to his family's cabin sets everything into motion. He is not introduced as a warrior hungry for conflict, but as someone weary from years away, caring for his ailing mother, and longing for the familiarity of home. His intentions are quiet: retirement, stewardship, and peace. Yet he arrives to find his land transformed into a stage set for political theater, surrounded by signs, models, and ambitions that threaten to erase his family history. The key to Carter's character is that he fights not with aggression but with precision. His background as a federal land inspector makes him unusually equipped to spot deception, from fabricated reports to counterfeit authorities. Where others might have been intimidated, he responds with equal parts humor and unshakable confidence, famously collecting the plastic boundary markers Karen Pierce had planted on his lawn and relocating them to her porch. This small act becomes emblematic of his resistance style, calm, symbolic, decisive. Over time, his role grows from landowner to guardian, not just protecting property lines but safeguarding his entire community from manipulation. If Carter represents patience, integrity, and factual authority, Karen Pierce embodies the opposite. As the HOA president, she begins the story with polish and poise, her blazer crisp, her jargon rehearsed. She knows exactly how to cloak ambition with charm, and her words drip with the kind of corporate fluency that can make even unlawful schemes sound reasonable. But beneath the veneer is a hunger for control. Karen seizes on Carter's absence as an opportunity, pushing her Greenway Neighborhood Enhancement Project on the basis of pseudo-legal claims of abandonment. As doubt begins to surround her, she doesn't withdraw. She doubles down, escalating step by step from manipulation to outright deception. Karen is therefore a study in how unchecked power metastasizes. She begins with fabricated authority, shifts into social coercion, commissions smear campaigns, and finally resorts to impersonating officials. By the humiliating watershed demonstration, her ignorance is laid bare for all to see, exposing that her authority was never rooted in knowledge or legitimacy. Yet her desperation makes her dangerous, illustrating the lengths a single manipulator may go when her empire of lies begins to collapse. Between these opposing forces stands Riley Moore, the attorney, whose calm presence provides both intellectual clarity and moral compass. In scenes where neighbors hesitate, Riley steps in with the steady authority of someone who understands the law and refuses to let it be twisted. She is not dramatic, not prone to speeches, but confident, careful, and surgical with language. She exposes Karen's exploitation not only by citing statutes, but by teaching the community what genuine legal authority looks like. Her professionalism elevates Carter's defense beyond one man's defense of his cabin. With Riley's counsel, the battle becomes a demonstration of lawful process versus manipulation. More than an advisor, she functions as the conscience of the neighborhood, redirecting frightened residents from anxiety back toward evidence. Riley's role makes the dispute larger than ownership. She transforms it into a case study in citizenship and civic courage. The neighbors themselves are not passive background, but an evolving character in their own right. Early on, they become pawns in Karen's manipulations, attending her meetings, nodding along to her claims, believing the emotional appeals about children, shared spaces, and land values. They embody the vulnerability of ordinary people, confronted with authority wrapped in complexity. Yet across the narrative, their arc shifts dramatically. Neighbors become skeptical, then suspicious, and finally resistant. Tom Bradley testifies to coercion, Sarah Mills recalls intimidation, and Louise Harper, perhaps the most important of them, anchors their collective memory by producing historical records and reminding the group of truths that predated Karen's reign. The community's gradual awakening demonstrates both how power can corrode and how solidarity can heal once deception is exposed. Among all secondary figures, Louise Harper deserves special recognition. At 70, she holds the wisdom of decades spent walking the land with her husband, remembering survey stones others forgot. She is the memory bearer, the quiet witness who bridges past and present. Without Louise, the federal marker might not have been understood, the 1963 fire maps might not have resurfaced, and the community might not have remembered its origins. In her, we see how elders provide continuity, preserving truths that powerful newcomers cannot erase. Her presence reassures the protagonist and strengthens the neighbors. Louise embodies the theme that stability rests not in the loudest voices or slickest presentations, but in the steadfast recollection of history maintained across generations. Each character, then, represents more than themselves. Carter embodies integrity and stewardship, refusing to yield to fear. Karen embodies ambition that slides into delusion, showing how power erodes when it serves only personal gain. Riley embodies principle, the law used properly as shield against abuse. The neighbors embody susceptibility but also resilience, moving from manipulation to unity. Louise embodies memory, the living archive that secures continuity. Together, their interplay creates dramatic tension that transcends simple plot. It becomes a mirror of how societies function. Leaders who exploit, protectors who resist, communities that must choose between fear and truth, and the importance of remembering roots in times of crisis. By the end, the characters create not only resolution but transformation. Carter has grown from individual defender into community steward. Karen has shrunk from polished leader to desperate manipulator left with nothing but silence. Riley has strengthened her role as trusted advocate. The neighbors, once divided, have become united through shared recognition of truth. And Louise, the quiet memory keeper, has guided them toward legitimacy. Through these characters, the narrative reminds us that history, law, and stewardship are not abstract values. They are embodied in people, shaped by choices, and carried forward in how they act when tested. The story unfolds like a slow-motion storm, one small disturbance swelling into a full gale through the steady escalation of conflict. It begins innocently enough with Karen Pierce, the HOA president, standing on the porch in a sharp blazer, armed with a polished speech about community values and underused land. At first glance, her claims almost sound logical. The cabin had been quiet for 3 years. The property had gone functionally inactive, and neighbors could benefit from transforming the parcel into a shared greenway. Through this initial claim, she asserted abandonment, cloaking ambition in benevolent language. Yet beneath the polished rhetoric was a dangerous precedent, an HOA acting as though it had eminent domain powers it clearly lacked. This first step in the conflict establishes the seed of escalation, an attempt to normalize an outrageous claim by wrapping it in corporate niceties. Once challenged, Karen does not retract her assertions but sharpens them, moving into full tactical manipulation. When neighbors express doubt, she deploys emotional persuasion, framing Carter's absence as abandonment of responsibility rather than a daughter's devotion to an ailing parent. She plants suspicions through social visits, spreading narratives of neglect, selfishness, and disregard for shared values. She orchestrates meetings where glossy posters and colorful models display a picture of community trails and happy families, tying her ambitious development plans to ideas of unity and childhood memories. Yet these appeals mask a deeper intent, replacing lawful ownership with communal coercion. This layer of manipulation thrives on emotions, bypassing critical thought, and it marks the conflict's first serious escalation. No longer just a claim about abandoned property, it becomes a social weapon designed to isolate and weaken her opposition. The conflict continues deepening as Karen introduces the third phase, a legal standoff based on paperwork, smoke, and mirrors. She arrives at county offices bearing boxes of charts, declarations, and HOA records, stuffed with jargon about architecture reviews and neighborhood maintenance. In contrast, the protagonist brings a simple deed and a photograph of an old federal survey marker. To the untrained, Karen's display appears overwhelming. All those files, all those stamps. But seasoned inspectors and Riley, the attorney, see through it. Still, this escalation is dangerous, because the sheer volume of claims confuses neighbors and bureaucrats alike. It illustrates a common tactic of manipulators: overwhelm with documents, blur distinctions between legal-looking and legally binding, and hope intimidation supplants fact. Though temporary, the tactic raises stakes by taking the battle from front lawns into conference rooms, where deception can masquerade as authority. But Karen cannot win on paper alone, and so she escalates again, moving into the fourth phase, fraudulent escalation. Here, her schemes break into overt criminality. She initiates smear campaigns through a fabricated media outlet called Valley Collective News. She organizes fake inspectors who show up with official-looking credentials and phony reports citing fire safety, hazards, and environmental violations. She mails coercive letters to residents, citing damages and penalties that do not exist, hoping to terrify people into compliance. These moves transform the conflict from a messy neighborhood quarrel into interstate fraud. They reveal Karen's willingness to wield intimidation, deception, and even impersonation of government agencies to protect her agenda. And though each tactic eventually unravels, exposed through inspection, investigation, or research, The escalation demonstrates a person sliding from questionable overreach into flat-out criminal operation. She is no longer bending rules, she is fabricating them. The turning point arrives with the fifth stage, collapse under truth. The protagonist organizes a watershed demonstration, releasing biodegradable dyes into the valley runoff to trace natural boundaries once codified in federal land surveys. The flowing colors create undeniable evidence of history, real boundaries shaped by nature documented in records now visible to every eye. Scientific proof combines with legal precedent to destroy the illusion of Karen's authority. Officials, neighbors, and even former allies recognize that her empire was built not just on shaky ground but on deliberate lies. From this moment, the conflict's trajectory cannot be reversed. What began as a dubious claim of abandonment concludes with federal indictments, revoked licenses, restitution orders, and the dismantling of a multi-state scam. Her escalation strategy, step by step, created her downfall. Each new tactic inflated the risk, widened exposure, and ensured that once she collapsed, she would not collapse quietly but spectacularly. Viewed through this escalation framework, the tale feels inevitable. Each step feeds the next. An exaggeration becomes manipulation, which becomes a standoff, which becomes fraud, which collapses when truth finally pierces the web of lies. Escalation functions like gravity. Karen's tactics could only pull her deeper towards exposure. What's remarkable is how each phase reveals not simply her character, but broader lessons about human conflict. False authority often begins small, disguised in seemingly reasonable demands. Left unchecked, it grows into larger manipulations, sanctioned by fear and paperwork. If resisted with evidence, it often escalates into fraud because deception requires fresh lies to sustain itself. And ultimately, because truth leaves stronger traces than falsehoods, collapse is all but guaranteed. By mapping the conflict step by step, it becomes clear that this story is not simply about one man in his cabin, but about how abuse grows when it is tolerated, and how exposure grows when it is confronted. The escalation shows us that power built on deception cannot plateau. It must either keep escalating or crumble. Here the collapse was dramatic, but the lesson is enduring. Vigilance, law, and truth are the only tools that stop escalation before it consumes everything. The dispute that began on a cracked porch in Carter Basin concluded not merely with the vindication of one man's deed, but with a resolution that rippled across his community, his county, and even far beyond. By the time federal prosecutors had assembled their case, the conflict had evolved into something much larger than a neighborhood quarrel. It had become a test case for how citizens, law, and governance respond when authority is abused systematically. The resolution unfolded in several intertwined layers: legal outcomes restoring balance, community reforms mending trust, environmental protections honoring the land itself, cultural links tying past to present, and the hard lessons that all participants carried with them. At the legal level, the outcome was firm and decisive. The mountain of fabricated paperwork, counterfeit oversight bodies, and manipulative tactics could not survive the scrutiny of federal investigators. Fraud charges, impersonation of officials, wire and mail fraud, conspiracy, and witness intimidation stacked higher than Karen Pierce's colored charts had ever reached. Faced with overwhelming evidence, she accepted a plea deal, avoiding decades in prison but effectively ending her career and influence forever. Restitution orders demanded repayment of fraudulent fees, financed by liquidating her assets. Her ally Noah, though spared the harshest consequences by cooperating, was permanently disqualified from management roles. Deeds, markers, and survey maps were reaffirmed by the courts, cementing Carter's family ownership and stopping any further challenge. The legal resolution reinforced a simple truth: facts endure, and no performance of authority can outweigh actual law. Yet legal punishment alone could not repair what had fractured among neighbors during the long months of conflict. The social fabric of Carter Basin had been strained. Fear had divided households. Whispers had pitted friends against one another, and some had genuinely doubted whether stability or truth mattered more. The resolution therefore demanded community healing. With Riley's guidance, the HOA was restructured with transparency at its core. Meetings opened with clear records accessible to all. Financial reporting moved into sunlight so that no neighbor ever again had to question where assessments were going. Residents who had once believed the false narratives began to find reassurance in open dialogue. where debates were guided by actual documentation rather than rumor. Trust having been weaponized and shattered, began the slow and deliberate process of being rebuilt. Equally vital was the environmental resolution, which gave the conflict its unexpected yet most enduring legacy. The Dye Tracer watershed demonstration had not merely exposed Karen's ignorance, but also awakened the valley to the land's silent wisdom. Those colored streams became visual proof that boundaries were not arbitrary lines drawn in boardrooms, but reflections of natural systems, runoff, drainage, and ecological corridors that safeguarded fire safety and sustainability. On the basis of that science, county officials formally designated the runoff paths as conservation zones, protecting them from development. The Carter Basin sign that was later installed next to the weathered survey marker did more than declare victory. It symbolized stewardship, locking into law what had already been written by the land itself. Now, generations forward, both property rights and emergency safety would be respected through ecological preservation. Culturally, resolution came with acknowledgement that legacy matters. Louise Harper emerged as a vital bridge linking the present conflict with the valley's past. By producing her late husband's fire maps, recounting the old railroad survey, and standing as living proof of historic memory, she gifted the community continuity. In celebrating the legal victory, residents also celebrated the endurance of their valley's history. Memory was no longer just sentiment, it became evidence, protection, and guidance. That acknowledgement transformed the community's understanding. They saw themselves not just as homeowners, but as heirs of a shared legacy, entrusted with responsibility alongside rights. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the Carter Basin conflict imparted lessons that extended far beyond geography. Residents learned to question authority rather than yield blindly to polished voices. They discovered the difference between official-sounding jargon and actual legal process. They experienced firsthand how division weakens a community, but also how transparency and truth can rebuild it stronger. And nationally, the resolution provided law enforcement with a case study on HOA fraud tactics, fraudulent media spin, and the impersonation of regulatory authority. What had begun as one man defending his cabin porch ended by reshaping policies, teaching officials how to better protect vulnerable homeowners, and sending a warning to anyone considering similar schemes. When the final gathering took place at the clubhouse, the atmosphere was utterly different from the dark, manipulative meetings it had previously hosted. Rather than whispers and suspicion, there was conversation, relief, and determination. People stood together, aware of both how close they had come to being deceived and how resilient they had been once the truth surfaced. By the time the Carter Basin Protected Watershed sign was unveiled beside the ancient granite marker, neighbors were not celebrating the downfall of a corrupt leader as much as they were celebrating collective endurance. The marker itself had always carried authority, but now it bore renewed weight as a reminder that real power exists in truth, not intimidation. So the resolution of the Carter Basin conflict was never just about reclaiming property. It was about legal accountability returning power to its rightful place, about community reforms creating safeguards for the future, about ecological systems being recognized as guides for human decision-making, about history acting as a compass for modern disputes, and about the enduring human lesson that vigilance, unity, and stewardship matter. In the end, Carter did not simply protect his land. He helped his community discover that the truest boundary is not drawn on paper, but in the shared determination to protect what is just, lawful, and worth preserving.